Ja. So, jetzt habe ich auch Ton. Könnte ja klappen. Sehe auch den Pegel in Video out. Das ist Video in, Video out. Können wir ein bisschen runter. So, zack, 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 zack. 1, 2, 3. 3, 2, 1. Jawohl, ja, ja. So laut sprechen die hoffentlich nicht. Super. Warum zerrt denn das hier, diese Kiste da? So, zack. Zack, 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 zack. 1, 2, 3. Jawohl, ja, 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 ja. Super, super. Jetzt eure Kopfhörer. Da ist einer.
Muss ich den Laptop jetzt laufen lassen oder?
Können Sie machen, müssen Sie aber nicht. Also das ist egal, weil jetzt wird einfach zur Webseite gestreamt. Ne? Ich streame da ja hin.
Und wenn ich dann später wieder aufklappe, wegen Chat vielleicht.
Bitte?
Wenn ich dann mit dem Chat irgendwie interagieren möchte, kann ich dann auch einfach aufklappen und dann bin ich wieder.
Genau, wir sind immer online. Dauert hier einen Moment, weil Sie sind hier im Öffentlichen, ne? Das zieht sich. Und wir haben, also es kann bis zu versetzt gestreamt auf YouTube bis zu 2 Minuten.
So, jetzt eben hatten wir, glaube ich, einen Versatz von so 20 Sekunden.
Das ist doch super. Ne, da muss man dran denken. Ja, ja. Ne, dass man da. Ja, 1, 2, 3. Ja, ja. Eins, zwei.
Sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie ganz herzlich zur 7. Jahrestagung des Verbandes Digital Humanities im deutschsprachigen Raum hier an der Universität Paderborn begrüßen. Ich freue mich, dass Sie so zahlreich erschienen sind, hier zur Eröffnung im Heinz Nixdorf MuseumsForum, dem weltgrößten Computermuseum. Ich hoffe, dass einige von Ihnen schon die Gelegenheit hatten, vorab mal kurz durchs Museum zu schauen, um sich Anregungen zu holen, dann auch gerne wiederzukommen, während Sie noch in Paderborn sind, oder zurückzukommen, um sich Zeit dafür zu nehmen. Ich werde meine Begrüßung kurz halten, weil Sie sind alle ja schon gespannt auf den Eröffnungsvortrag von Julia Flanders, unserer Gastrednerin heute. Ich freue mich, dass wir hier die Tagung ausrichten können zum Motto Spielräume. Spielräume haben wir uns ja als Tagungsmotto auch sehr zu Herzen genommen, im doppeldeutigen Sinne. Also wir möchten uns Spielräume schaffen in der Wissenschaft, in der Forschung, dass wir nicht immer nur schwarz-weiß malen, dass es nur richtig oder falsch gibt, 2 Kategorien, sondern manchmal kann man es vielleicht nicht entscheiden. Manchmal möchte man sich Freiheiten, Interpretationsspielräume offen halten. Und das ist auch in unseren zahlreichen Workshops der letzten beiden Tage, gestern und heute, deutlich geworden. Tools, wo wir umgehen können, die uns auch helfen, bei unserer Forschung computergestützt voranzukommen. Wir werden jetzt in den nächsten Tagen spannende Vorträge auch zu unserem Tagungsmotto hören. Und natürlich der zweite Sinn, die Räume. Wir spielen auch ein bisschen natürlich mit diesem Wort. Wir wechseln die Räumlichkeiten. Wir sind am Campus der Universität, sind im Computermuseum, werden fürs Conference Dinner in das Fußballstadion gehen. Das ist die andere Bedeutung für Spielen. Und natürlich auch die Möglichkeit, immer in den Gesprächen auch über die verschiedenen Möglichkeiten in den Kaffeepausen, in den Mittagspausen darüber zu sprechen. Was ist für Sie in Ihrer Forschung wichtig? Wo möchten Sie sich nicht einengen lassen? Was sind Möglichkeiten, wie wir solche Themen modellieren können, um dann eben geeignete Lösungen für unsere Forschung zu finden? Das soll es jetzt als mein einführendes Grußwort gewesen sein. Ich möchte Sie ganz herzlich in Paderborn heute begrüßen. Wir werden jetzt als nächstes dann das Grußwort unseres Dekans, Professor Volker Peckhaus der Fakultät für Kulturwissenschaften als Abgesandter der Universität Paderborn hören. Danach wird Christoph Schöch als Vorstandsvorsitzender des Verbands DHd ein paar Grußworte an Sie richten, bevor wir dann endlich Julia Flanders Vortrag ankündigen und Sie gespannt ihrer Keynote lauschen dürfen. Vielen Dank.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, ich darf Sie ganz herzlich im Namen der Fakultät für Kulturwissenschaften und wohl auch der Gesamtuniversität Paderborn zur 7. Jahrestagung des Verbandes Digital Humanities im deutschsprachigen Raum begrüßen. Ich bin stolz darauf und bin auch dem Organisationsteam sehr dankbar, dass es uns gelungen ist, diese Tagung nach Paderborn zu holen. Und ich freue mich auch ganz besonders, dass ich Sie hier an diesem symbolträchtigen Ort begrüßen darf. Dieser Ort verkörpert wie kein anderer, wofür Paderborn heute steht, die Verbindung von Tradition und Hochtechnologie. Wenn Sie das Angebot der Museumsführung oder dieses Ganges durch die Sammlungen angenommen haben, dann werden Sie gesehen haben, dass diese Sammlungen mit den frühesten Nachweisen rechnerischen Denkens im antiken Babylon beginnen und mit Visionen über eine digitalisierte Welt enden. Wenn Sie diese Dialektik zwischen Tradition und Moderne sich ansehen, wenn man das jetzt auf die Stadt überträgt, Paderborn ist eine alte Kaiserstadt. Karl der Große hat den Papst hier getroffen, noch bevor er groß war, und die Gründung des Deutschen Reiches hier verabredet. Aber es ist auch eine Stadt mit einer der größten IT-Dichten in Deutschland. Und das hat viel mit dem Namensgeber dieses Museums zu tun, mit Heinz Nixdorf, der ja einer der wichtigen Computerpioniere in Deutschland war. Wenn Sie es auf die Universität übertragen, in Paderborn finden Sie nicht nur mit der 1614 gegründeten Theologischen Fakultät die älteste Hochschule Westfalens, aber auch die sehr viel größere Universität Paderborn, die erst im Jahr 1972 gegründet wurde und damit zu den neueren Universitäten gehört. Die Verbindung zum HNI oder zum HNF sehen Sie auch dadurch, dass das HNF inzwischen durch Universitätsinstitute umzingelt ist. Wir nennen das hier Zukunftsmeile Fürstenallee. Auf der Seite haben Sie das HNI, das Heinz Nixdorf Institut, und das Fraunhofer Institut auf der anderen Seite. Also wir bilden hier so eine symbiotische Gemeinschaft mit dem HNF. Die Universität Paderborn hat ca. 20.000 Studierende, von denen etwa 8.000 in der Fakultät für Kulturwissenschaften studieren. Wir sind also mit Abstand die größte Fakultät. Die Herausforderung der Digitalisierung haben wir in Forschung und Lehre schon lange aufgenommen. Mit der Einrichtung eines Schwerpunktes für Digital Humanities wollen wir uns diesem Zukunftsthema noch effektiver verpflichten. So hat die Universität Paderborn den Profilbereich Digital Humanities eingerichtet, der ganz wesentlich von den Kulturwissenschaften und der Informatik getragen wird. Einer der Leuchttürme ist sicherlich das ZENMEM, das Zentrum Musik, Edition, Medien, in dem die Universität Paderborn, die Hochschule für Musik in Detmold und die Hochschule Ostwestfalen-Lippe in Lemgo kooperieren und mit dem ein international sichtbares Kompetenzzentrum an der Schnittstelle zwischen Geisteswissenschaften und Informatik etabliert werden konnte. Nicht zuletzt haben wir einen fakultätsübergreifenden Masterstudiengang für Digital Humanities eingerichtet. Ich möchte noch einmal allen, die diese Tagung möglich gemacht haben, danken. Denen, die sie möglich gemacht haben, und Ihnen, die Sie auch dafür sorgen, dass hier ein wirklich schönes Event stattfindet. Ich hoffe, dass Sie als Teilnehmende den Aufenthalt in Paderborn als gewinnbringend in Erinnerung halten werden und wünsche Ihnen ertragreiche Tage. Das war es schon. Ich wünsche Ihnen viel Erfolg und wirklich eine schöne Zeit in Paderborn. Dankeschön.
Ja, schön hier zu sein. Sehr geehrter Herr Dekan, liebe Frau Geierhus, liebe Julia, liebe Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer der Jahrestagung des DHd-Verbands. Ich freue mich außerordentlich, Sie alle heute Abend im Namen des gesamten Vorstands bei der Eröffnungsveranstaltung der 7. Jahrestagung des DHd-Verbands begrüßen zu dürfen. Wir treffen uns unter ein bisschen besonderen Rahmenbedingungen, die ich gleich am Anfang und ganz kurz thematisieren möchte. Nach intensiver Diskussion haben wir im Vorstand Ende letzter Woche entschieden, dass die DHd 2020 wie geplant stattfinden soll. Zugleich haben wir die Notwendigkeit gesehen, das nicht ohne Berücksichtigung der aktuellen Lage bezüglich des Coronavirus zu tun. In direkter Anlehnung an die Empfehlungen des Robert-Koch-Instituts zur Abschätzung und Reduzierung des Risikos bei Großveranstaltungen haben wir, wie Sie alle wissen, einigen Personengruppen schweren Herzens von der Teilnahme an der diesjährigen Tagung abgeraten. Wir hoffen, dass alle, die zu Hause geblieben sind, bei Twitter und auf YouTube im Livestream jetzt und die ganze Woche dabei sind und so trotzdem ein bisschen was mitbekommen. War wirklich keine einfache Entscheidung. Wir möchten aber auch an Sie alle appellieren, während der Tagung die ohnehin in der Grippesaison empfohlenen Schutzmaßnahmen zu ergreifen, vor allem ständig Hände waschen. Ich hoffe, dass wir mit dieser Strategie verantwortungsvoll, aber auch maßvoll mit der aktuellen Situation umgegangen sind. Jetzt sind wir aber ja bereits mittendrin in der Tagung und ich möchte betonen, wie sehr ich mich darüber freue, dass wir nun schon das 7. Mal zur DHd-Tagung zusammenkommen. Die DHd-Tagung hat sich seit der ersten Ausgabe in Passau im Jahr 2014 zu einem wichtigen Schaufenster der Digital Humanities im deutschsprachigen Raum entwickelt. Hier werden die neuesten Ergebnisse aus so etablierten Themenbereichen wie digitale Edition oder quantitative Textanalyse vorgestellt. Hier zeigt sich die Konsolidierung von Arbeitsbereichen wie digitalen Bildwissenschaften oder digitalen Musikwissenschaften in den DH. Und hier sieht man, wie sich neuere Trends verbreiten. Dieses Jahr sind das sicherlich die verstärkte Theoriebildung, das reflektierte maschinelle Lernen und Linked Open Data, um nur einige zu nennen, die vielleicht mir besonders aufgefallen sind. Viele von Ihnen waren vielleicht schon in Passau, Graz, Leipzig, Bern, Köln oder in Mainz und Frankfurt dabei. Die Liste wird jedes Jahr ein klein bisschen länger. Trotzdem möchte ich auch dieses Jahr ausdrücklich all diejenigen begrüßen, die zum ersten Mal bei der DHD-Tagung sind oder ihre ersten Schritte in den Digital Humanities machen. Wir haben alle mal angefangen und heißen Sie ganz besonders herzlich willkommen. Ich möchte an dieser Stelle bereits den Stipendiatinnen und Stipendiaten gratulieren, die dieses Jahr durch ein Reisekostenstipendium gefördert werden, und Sie sollten auch die Namen gleich sehen. Das klappt vielleicht in ein paar Momenten. Da sind Sie, wunderbar. Sie sehen jetzt die Namen auf dem Bildschirm. Die feierliche Verleihung der Urkunden wird morgen Abend in kleinerem Kreis im Rathaus stattfinden. Trotzdem hier schon mal herzlichen Glückwunsch an Sie alle und herzlichen Dank an die Förderer, claria.de und die Universität Paderborn. Und der DHD-Verband ist hier natürlich auch gerne dabei. Die Freude des Vorstands über die Jahrestagung ist verbunden mit großer Dankbarkeit den Organisatorinnen und Organisatoren gegenüber. Hier möchte ich zunächst der Leitung der Universität Paderborn dafür danken, dass sie den Organisatorinnen vor Ort bei der Ausrichtung unterstützt haben. Und ich möchte Frau Michaela Geierhus, ihrem Team und dem gesamten lokalen Organisationsteam danken. Das sind zu viele Personen, um sie jetzt hier alle zu nennen, aber ich möchte nur sagen, wir wissen, das ist eine Riesenaufgabe, der Sie sich alle gestellt haben. Ich habe größtes Vertrauen, dass alles wunderbar klappen wird und auch, dass wir alle locker damit umgehen werden, wenn es doch mal irgendwo klemmen sollte, was ich mir überhaupt nicht vorstellen kann. Ganz vielen Dank. Zur Tagungsorganisation gehört auch ganz wesentlich das Erstellen des Programms. Ich möchte allen Mitgliedern des Programmkomitees recht herzlich für ihren Einsatz danken. Auch den vielen Gutachterinnen und Gutachtern möchte ich sehr danken. Sie haben rund 600 Gutachten geschrieben und damit die Entscheidungen des Programmkomitees erst ermöglicht. Dankeschön. Noch ein besonderer Dank an dieser Stelle jetzt schon an Frau Geierhus, die in diesem Jahr als Vertreterin der lokalen Organisatoren im Programmkomitee war. Sie hat sich bereit erklärt, traditionsgemäß für die nächste Tagung den Vorsitz des PK zu übernehmen. Danke auch dafür. Bitte erlauben Sie mir abschließend noch den Hinweis auf die diesjährige Mitgliederversammlung, zu der alle Mitglieder des DHD-Verbands bereits ordnungsgemäß eingeladen worden sind. Sie findet morgen Mittwoch ab 16 Uhr im Audimax der Universität statt. Wir würden uns freuen, wenn Sie zahlreich zu dieser Veranstaltung erschienen. Neben dem Jahresbericht des Vorstands wird es auch um die vielen AGs im DHD-Verband gehen, um die Weiterentwicklung der DHD-Abstracts zu einer vollwertigen Publikation, um den Review-Prozess bei der DHD und um das Verhältnis von DHD zu EADH und ADHO. Außerdem wird das traditionelle Ratebild zum Standort der DHD-Konferenz im nächsten Jahr gezeigt. Es wird also mal wieder richtig aufregend, ich verspreche es. Jetzt bleibt mir nur noch Ihnen und euch allen eine erfolgreiche, lehrreiche, kommunikative Tagung mit guter Laune und viel Gelegenheit zum inhaltlichen Austausch und zum Netzwerken zu wünschen. Vielen Dank.
So, ich darf Ihnen endlich unsere Gastrednerin präsentieren. Julia Flanders ist Professorin an der Northeastern University. Sie leitet dort das Women Writers Project und ist Chefredakteurin von Digital Humanities Quarterly, was Ihnen sicherlich allen etwas sagen wird. Sie hat ihre Ausbildung in den digitalen Geisteswissenschaften in den frühen 90er Jahren begangen und ist sehr stark aktiv im TI-Konsortium. Arbeitet in zahlenden digitalen Geisteswissenschaften-Projekten mit, konzentriert sich mit ihren Forschungsinteressen dabei insbesondere auf Datenmodellierung, Textwissenschaft und Kuration geisteswissenschaftlicher Daten und Sie kennen sicherlich das Buch, was sie zusammen mit Ioannis herausgegeben hat, was auch ein sehr interessantes Buch zur Datenmodellierung ist. Mit ein Grund natürlich, warum wir Sie gerade bei unserem Tagungsmotto gebeten haben, die Eröffnungskeynote zu halten, mit Ihrem Vortrag heute zum Thema From Modeling to Interpretation. It's your stage.
Guten Abend und vielen Dank. Thank you so much for this kind welcome. Thank you, Dr. Geierhus, and to the program committee for inviting me. It is a great honor and a great privilege to be among so many people whose work I have admired and benefited from for so long, so thank you. I want to start with a couple of acknowledgements. First, this work draws very heavily on my collaboration with Ioannis on our workshop and the recent volume on data modeling in digital humanities, and indeed on the work of all the contributors to that volume. I also want to express my gratitude to my student and colleague, William Reed Quinn, for making me aware of the importance of weak theory. These days I feel as though everything I learn from my students, so it was a delight to learn that from him. And finally, I want to acknowledge a strong debt to my colleague, Amanda Rust, who has been leading the Digital Scholarship Group's efforts in thinking about how modeling and interpretation can be redirected towards goals of social justice. The American poet Robert Frost is widely and variously quoted as having likened free verse to playing tennis with a net down. And as an undergraduate student writing a senior thesis on Robert Frost, I thought this was a wonderful metaphor. Looking it up recently, I found an equally wonderful, maybe more wonderful, rebuke from Frost's contemporary Carl Sandburg. Let's see if I can work this thing. The poet without imagination or folly enough to play tennis by serving and returning the ball over an invisible net may see himself as highly disciplined. There have been poets who could and did play more than one game of tennis with unseen rackets, volleying airy and fantastic balls over an insubstantial net on a frail moonlit fabric of a court. For me, these days, everything is a metaphor for data modeling. And this one seems particularly apt, given the theme for this conference. I'm sure over the next few days we will hear much subtler explorations, but let me start with an obvious one. Data modeling is partly about creating a space of action, perhaps a Spielraum, a space of play, perhaps an Arbeitsraum, a workshop or studio, a space of constraint in which the constraint, whether real or imagined, frames the meaningful challenges and outcomes. Frank Fischer this morning asked me to say what I thought the position of the TEI was within the landscape of data modeling, and I found myself giving an impassioned spiel about the history of the TEI, its initial vision of an interchange format, its internal debates about strictness and conformity, and what I take to be its greatest achievement, namely the creation of a customization and localization mechanism that affords its users the ability to create strong or weak local constraints, their own Spielraum, if you like, while remaining in meaningful conversation and collaboration with the rest of the TEI world. What I would like to talk about this evening is the ways in which this kind of Spielraum is not just about us and our own game of tennis. To pursue the metaphor possibly past endurance, how do we avoid building a country club? The foundational work of information modeling is curatorial. That is, it is substantially directed towards goals of creating information resources that can be used as reference or foundation for research and interpretive work. For example, critical editing intensifies the formal conventions of typography, which I saw modeled up in the museum upstairs just a few minutes ago, to model a multidimensional universe of texts, including their differences and the commentary upon them, from the variorum editions of the 17th century to the digital editions and archives of our own time. A second example, metadata and information organization about collections of documents, including systems like the random access card catalog attributed to Baron Gottfried von Swieten at the Austrian National Library, with its categorization of books through author, title, date, subject, and then further formalization of additional information, leading ultimately to standards like MARC, RDA, and to the metadata information models that are now so prevalent in digital humanities. Modeling, in this curatorial sense, is strongly future-directed and also strongly rule-oriented. It envisions and anticipates forms of order and action towards which it strives. And it can thus also be understood as a tool of power, a world-making tool. It establishes a formal framework within which each individual semantic unit has its meaning, and it typically results not only in a schema for that framework, but also prescriptive documentation. If we recall Christoph Schoch's characterization of two core types of humanities data, big data and smart data, then modeling is the hallmark of smart data, data that is explicitly structured, shaped by a formal model, and that is also clean, not only in the sense that it is that noise and erratic information that is at odds with that model has been eliminated, but also in that we possess a consistently executed theory of the data. The data and its constraint systems form an internally consistent statement about the world, nothing out of place. Christoph's analysis counters smart data with big data, which lacks such modeling, although it does express models in another way, a topic for an entirely different paper, one which I hope to hear sometime in the next few days. But both big data and smart data seek to offer insight into what Weichi Dimmock calls strong theoretical approaches, high-level ways of accounting for literary phenomena, historical phenomena, and so forth, periodization, genre, geography, influence, historical contextualization, and so forth. Phenomena that exercise a totalizing explanatory force. Dimmock's article explores the ways in which weak theory might bring new insight into a field dominated by strong theoretical approaches. And she situates this dynamic within the history of science, in particular, the debate between Robert Boyle and Thomas Hobbes over the status of experimental science, described in fascinating detail in Chapin and Schaffer's 1985 book, Leviathan and Air Pump. In strong theory, as Dimmock puts it, quoting Pierre Bourdieu, every individual instance is a manifestation of the field as a whole, in which all the powers of the field and all the determinisms inherent in its structure and functioning are concentrated. Large-scale arguments about political and cultural institutions can be invoked as homologies for the small-scale structures of words. This could read as a good description of the relationship between the modeled instance, the encoded document, and the schema that regulates it. And the application of models of this sort produces a clear boundary between what is valid and what is not, in the way that the data schema defines a clear interior and exterior, and exercises a kind of definitional infallibility in assigning instances to one or the other space. Models of this kind struggle to account for or accommodate exceptions when used in their most characteristic role as arbiters of consistency in support of large-scale data regulation. Probing the entailments of such approaches and invoking Bruno Latour for his attention instead to a more centrifugal, networked geometry of agency and theory, Dimmock proposes weak theory as a way of dispersing and localizing our explanatory work, getting away from sovereign axioms and focusing instead on associative connections, local mediation, and site specificity. As she puts it, these dispersed, episodic webs of association, not supervised and not formalizable, make it an open question what is primary, what is determinative, what counts as the center and what counts as the margins. A paradigm such as this is fundamentally different from the causally singular closed-circuit totality of Hobbes. Let us turn now for a moment to interpretation. I'm fascinated by an early symptomatic moment from some of the earliest discussions that accompanied the development of the TEI guidelines, in which the relation between modeling and interpretation emerges as a high-stakes design issue. The first version of the guidelines, P1, was released in November 1990, and a few months later, in February 1991, the TEI's Literature Working Group circulated a report on the TEI listserv titled Critique of the TEI Guidelines. I want to draw attention to two key points made by the critique's authors. First, that the shareable information the TEI seeks to model for purposes of exchanging digital data resources does not and should not involve interpretive information. Quote, literature scholars are not interested in fact, many object vehemently to, the perspective of obtaining texts which already contain explicitly or implicitly literary interpretations. And second, that there is an important separation of concerns based on professional identity, in which interpretation is identified with the work of the scholar rather than the coder. It is recognized that all coding can be seen as a kind of interpretation, but a fundamental distinction must be made here. A certain character is or is not in italic. Once the way of representing italic has been decided, a simple either-or decision carrying very little intellectual content will resolve the matter. Why a word is italicized is open to a number of interpretations. Scholars legitimately may not agree on which one or ones are valid. This is interpretation in the usual sense, and is the domain of the scholar working on the completed text, not that of the coder inputting or converting the text. Recommendations overlooking this distinction will alienate the vast majority of literature people working with computers. This critique clearly positions interpretation as following from, as an intellectual sequel to, the foundational work of modeling, but it also offers a fairly weak view of that foundation. Modeling establishes the text and thus serves as a form of lower criticism, and it is fundamentally convergent on a kind of consensus that is achievable because it is interpretively insignificant. Interpretation, in the usual sense, by contrast, is naturally divergent. Scholars don't want other people's interpretations, they want their own, and in particular, they want the freedom to establish their own. The critique was an early sign of what proved a long-standing irritant, an issue that demanded explicit mention in discussions of what encoding and transcription really meant for scholars. Scholars, including Marcus Walsh, Alois Pichler, and Peter Robinson, to quote just a few, argue passionately that even the smallest and apparently most trivial acts of transcription are deeply and consequentially interpretive, contra the assertion of the critique that there are some modeling decisions that are cut and dried, suitable for the coder. And in these discussions, we can see a shifting geometry of the relation between modeling and interpretation. First, as we see in the critique, there is a geometry of subordination in which the domains of modeling and interpretation are carefully bounded and aligned with professional hierarchies. Modeling here is a diminished and subservient activity that does not foreclose any interpretive options and does not constitute a competition with scholarly interpretive power. But it nonetheless has the potential to erupt disobediently from its proper positioning if it is accorded the power to take interpretive license. Closely neighboring to this relation, and perhaps even isomorphic with it, is a relation of power in which modeling exercises a coercive hegemony, a consensus that is not fully inclusive and by its nature never can be. Interpretation establishes and operates within a space outside of this constraint. This relation is also acknowledged in the critique. the authors point out the future likelihood that the TEI guidelines will be a standard, not simply a pathway for exchange, and that as such it will accrue the power to compel conformity. Indeed, they note a natural tendency for standards to emerge in this way. The work group understands that the TEI is proposing a coding system for interchange, not entry of texts. We realize also that many things are suggested as options, not as requirements. It must, however, also be recognized that simple considerations of efficiency will tend to foster the use of TEI codes at the local level. ASCII was originally proposed as an interchange code. It is now a standard for alphanumeric representation. The very polished and comprehensive nature of the present guidelines also means that there will be a tendency for them to become standards, both for interchange and local processing, and even data entry, very prescient. By a similar process, optional codes, in the absence of a clear distinction between the optional and the required, will tend to be considered as recommended or required, in spite of occasional or implicit indications to the contrary. Because of the way it relocates power into the modeling activity, this relation also brings into visibility the ways in which modeling influences interpretation by constituting the informational field it has to work with. But its coerciveness, here at least, operates at a practical rather than a theoretical level. The model here is not yet being accorded the status of ideology. More recent debates over the role of theory and cultural criticism in digital humanities have elicited stronger statements, ranging from Susan Smullyan's blunt, "The database is the theory," to much longer explorations of the political inflections that may inhere in deep technical systems from scholars like Tara McPherson and Fiona Barnett. In their position, modeling is not only accorded the status of strong theory, but is also aligned with external ideological forms of hegemony that go beyond disciplinary consensus. Interpretation, in this view, struggles with the model not only in specific research contexts, but also almost universally. Our interpretive options are taken to be severely circumscribed by discourse and subject positioning, as well as by the modeling of our information resources. A less stark version, informed by current digital humanities working practice, would construe the relation between modeling and interpretation as one of reciprocity and co-construction, in which modeling and interpretation are engaged in a fundamentally dialogic and iterative process of knowledge creation. This vision also aligns with the ways in which digital humanities has adopted increasingly hybrid and collaborative professional roles, tending to blur the clear mapping of responsibility for modeling and interpretive work. The historical tendency, then, in digital humanities has been to accumulate power in our models to gain the situational advantages of strong modeling. For example, the value of consistency and conformance to shared standards in supporting data interchange, the value of a model as an expression of theoretical positioning, which is important in establishing this branch of digital humanities as genuine research. And as Michael Sperber McQueen has argued in his contribution to The Shape of Data, a model of this kind provides a basis for formal debate and analysis. The stronger the model and the better it regulates its field of information, the more substantively and unambiguously that debate can take place. But with those advantages fully acknowledged, researchers in digital humanities have also sought ways to mitigate the brittleness and coerciveness of strong models. David Birnbaum, quite a long time ago, gave a talk at the 1997 ACH-ALLC conference titled "In Defense of Invalid SGML," in which he noted the tension between the original goals of SGML to regulate the creation of new data and its use in a humanities context to structure the representation of pre-existing documents. And in this latter case, he notes, the source document may actually contain authentic violations of the logical structure that the schema seeks to enforce, which constitute important archaeographic information in their own right, even though they are errors. The central drama of his paper revolves around the conflict between the schema as a legitimate model of the document's own true and intended structure and the document's own violations of that structure. And these violations cannot simply be corrected, lest we lose the valuable information they offer, but neither can they be allowed to loosen the overall schema constraints, since that would constitute another loss of information about the document's true structural intentions. Birnbaum's solution, as suggested in his title, is that we permit invalid SGML markup to circulate as meaningful data, with the resulting error messages serving as a kind of formal acknowledgement of the friction between model and instance. Birnbaum's paper highlights the difference between descriptive and normative approaches to modeling humanities data, and this distinction has also played an important role in defining the contexts where the strongest forms of modeling are appropriate. First of all, those where the goals of constraint are so paramount that we are content to sacrifice variation. For instance, where data must operate within a functional framework that cannot be modified, such as a library catalog or a large public information network like Europeana or the Digital Public Library of America. And conversely, there are also contexts where a weaker model, so-called, better suits our purposes. As Dimock puts it, cases where our knowledge-making is not supervised and not formalizable. This might be in cases where the material being modeled resists alignment across instances, for instance, the kind of genre disobedience that Birnbaum describes. But it might also be in cases where the work of supervising and formalizing is in itself socially damaging through the imposition of knowledge paradigms on participants who, unlike the authors of the critique, are not in a position to resist, or whose trust and collaboration is more important to us than perfectly formalized data. I want to pause here and point out that interpretation in these discussions, dispersive, localized, exercised by individuals rather than organizations, could well play the role of the weak theory in relation to the strong modeling. As is becoming clear, one of the problems with modeling as strong theory is that it constitutes an imposition of will on populations and potential partners with whom we ought rather to have a bilateral relationship, rather than insisting that they play the excellent game of tennis on our club. We could thus imagine the space of interpretation and its improvisational logic as restoring the balance by offering a zone of free play that is open to all. But I would instead like to argue that the entire signifying circuit here, as currently constituted in digital humanities and indeed in the academy more broadly, is strong. Interpretation, and in particular scholarly interpretation, represents the value, the payout, the return on investment that authorizes modeling in the first place. Furthermore, interpretation as a funded professional activity, the research portion of our annual merit reporting, is structurally cohesive and institutionally foundational, even though individual interpretive work may go in widely divergent critical directions. In an important sense, the medium or the institution is the message here. Insofar as academic data modeling seeks to anticipate and underpin the interpretive operations of academic scholarship, it ensures that those operations are working from inputs that already carry a strongly authorized theoretical stamp. And insofar as scholarly interpretive operations, however their individual narratives may vary or offer local critiques, insofar as they seek a framework of intelligibility and value within the academy, They likewise ensure that the Academy will continue to invest in modeling frameworks that can continue to reproduce and underpin that interpretive work. In other words, it's not that modeling is strong and interpretation is weak, but rather that as practiced in the digital humanity, they constitute together a form of strong theory about the Academy itself and the forms of knowledge it can produce. The interpretive elements of transcription and encoding, for example, in Pichler's and Robinson's accounts, are precisely those that contribute to the establishment of a text that can be read and interpreted through established academic protocols. The forms of agency that were opened up early on, for instance, in the Canterbury Tales Project, for readers to choose their own editorial options and draw their own interpretive conclusions, are still strongly bounded by the terms and premises of the model, that the reader's free will is directed towards comparing witnesses and readings to establish a textual history of a major cultural work. Crowd-based approaches, which became prevalent in the first decade of the 21st century with projects like Galaxy Zoo and Transcribe Bentham, invite volunteers to identify with the research-oriented, although public-spirited, goals of these projects to create accurate data within the constraints provided by the contributory platform so as to support further academic research. As I observed earlier, strong modeling and interpretation have an important role to play in relation to the interests of the digital humanities. However, the Academy, and by extension our field, are now being asked more forcefully than ever before in our lifetimes whether and how they can really serve a purpose outside of their own bounds. Moreover, the recuperative motivations that early on prompted the creation of archives of women's writing and African American dramatists and the reassemblage of dispersed medieval manuscripts are now being turned to archives of even more strongly marginalized populations. And increased research attention is being paid to the history of those communities. At the same time, the power dynamics of that research attention are rightly coming under scrutiny. So as we turn our attention to public audiences and to partnerships with communities outside the Academy, we need to shift tactics and reimagine what both modeling and interpretation are for and whom they're for to disrupt their closed circuit of meaning. In particular, to the extent that interpretation can be a space of dispersive, open-ended agency, we need to be prepared to open that space up to interpretive work that may be deeply unfamiliar, unauthorized, critical, even antagonistic. We must genuinely allow it its own autonomous Spielraum. And to the extent that modeling approaches thus far have operated through standards that enforce consensus, we need to be prepared to open up the process by which that consensus is achieved. Eve Sedgwick, in a 1993 essay titled Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, identifies weak theory with reparative modes of reading, that is, reading that is aimed at constructing provisional, contingent narratives that seek wholeness rather than analytical accounts of power. And if prompted by this idea, we look to domains like community-based archiving that are practicing and theorizing a reparative agenda, we can find a set of principles that can help guide our own work in that direction. There's a tremendous amount we can learn from community-based archiving that applies well beyond that domain, not only about modeling and interpretive practices, but also about workflows, effective design processes, and sustainability. The Boston Research Center at Northeastern University, led by my colleague Amanda Rust, is working to bridge between research-oriented data modeling and tool infrastructure and community-led design practices, which is a steep learning curve indeed. I want to reference a handful of key points that seem particularly relevant to me here. First, as this quotation makes clear, agency is a crucial issue. In my discussion earlier, of the contested agencies of modeler and interpreter in text encoding, the range of eligible agents is comparatively narrow. The modeler, the coder, the interpreter all come from the academic or para-academic spaces: scholars, students, librarians, information technologists. Us. The scholars of community archiving Scholars of community archiving emphasize the importance of not simply extending agency to community participants or sharing agency with them, but ceding certain forms of agency to them altogether. For example, the right to control access to culturally sensitive materials, the right to control the ways those materials are described, modeled, and interpreted. Going beyond this, scholars such as Michelle Caswell and Jessica Tai propose that we consider archival records themselves as agents, and also as conferring agency upon their users and readers. And other scholars, including Stacy Wood, Marika Sifor, and Ricardo Ponzalan, have shown the importance of also considering those represented in the records as agents. This has the effect of establishing the right to be considered a stakeholder that can be understood as inhering in the fact of being represented in cultural materials. Thus, in the context of modeling and interpretation, in seeking a term to put into dialogue with strong, rather than weak, we might consider empowering or decentering or multilateralizing. Second, and closely related to the issue of agency, is a shift in the role and nature of expertise. For instance, as Ponzalan and Caswell argue, community archival discourses have expanded the notion of who has the power to process and control archival records. To encourage larger societal participation in archival endeavors, archivists are called to relinquish their role as authoritative professionals in order to assume a more facilitative role. There's a strong emerging body of work from Indigenous community organizations, such as the Plateau Peoples Portal, that places institutional catalog records and descriptions next to tribal records and descriptions and community-contributed tags and comments, thereby establishing parallel spaces of authority. And tools like the Mukatu content management system, developed by Kim Kristen, provide explicit systems for this kind of community-driven modeling, description, and interpretation. This diversification of authority may be harder to imagine and also needs to be understood within multiple vectors of power. Archivists and digital humanities practitioners are in many contexts encouraged to insist upon their distinctive expertise as a way of strengthening their position vis-a-vis faculty collaborators, while at the same time they're being asked to diminish that expertise and authority vis-a-vis citizen archivists. So they find themselves in a funny double bind. Thirdly, specific techniques have been identified that can inflect our modeling practices to balance conceptual economy and elegance, as Eve Sedgwick characterizes strong theory, with goals of empowerment and diversification of authority. As much as we may feel strong affinity for the principles of clean, smart data articulated in Christoph's article, we may also take insight from Trevor Munoz and Katie Rawson in Against Cleaning, where they recommend ways to preserve the original modeling that may come to us as noise, but may also carry important traces of the values and descriptive agendas of the original data creators. As they point out, linked open data may offer new opportunities for localization that avoid erasure of local knowledge systems. Rather than focusing our modeling efforts on establishing normative information structures and standards, projects like Documenting the Now and scholars like Lauren Klein suggest that we might focus on representing entities and relationships between entities, and in particular, on representing missing, invisible, and silenced voices. And to the extent that we still do need such large-scale structures and standards, Stacy Wood and her co-authors emphasize the importance of contingency and uncertainty in descriptive standards, And they note that standards like CDOC, for example, support the pluralization of entities, for example, in the context of provenance and other forms of agency, but does not yet support contingency and uncertainty in description. And as they say, descriptive standards must be better able to express relationships where contingency and uncertainty are defining factors. Finally, numerous scholars, for example in the discussions at Northeastern University's Design for Diversity forums, have observed the importance of adapting our modeling processes as work processes so that they are more porous and welcoming to participants who have not traditionally been included in our working groups, task forces, and design meetings. Such adaptations might include the same shifts in tone and pace that are now identified as good practice for accommodating colleagues in workplaces that are more diverse in class, gender, race, and neurodiversity. But they also require larger shifts, for example, shifts in funding structures, work planning, and project ownership. There's a lot to think about here, and I come to this conference as something of an outsider who nonetheless has observed and admired, and to a limited extent even participated in some of the work being done by this community. And I look forward very much to thinking with you further about how we might adapt and broaden and reshape our modeling and interpretive work so that it can respond to the changing demands on the digital humanities, indeed the academy as a whole. I welcome your questions and ideas. Thank you so much. And I am licensed to take questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk, and it was really enlightening for me. So you have been calling for enabling or empowering communities of cultural heritage to decide who's having the access to their cultural heritage data. Could you comment on your ideas, how this idea of providing agency provides a field of tension with regards to fair data?
Fair data?
Yeah, so findable, accessible,
yes,
interoperable, etc., which kind of, well, goes together with linked data, not necessarily open data, so there's a whole field of tension there, and I thought you would probably have some ideas on that and could comment on that.
Yes, no, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. I should say first that that's an area where I know that cultural heritage professionals are working very hard. I mean, it's so my ideas on the subject are probably less relevant than theirs, so immersed in it. But I will say that I have heard some very interesting talks, most recently a few years ago at the Digital Humanities Conference in McGill, that call into question, or at least culturally contextualize, the principles of transparency and the epistemology of transparency that underlies the fair and open data standards. And I think that, you know, within, let's say, a consensus, or within a I don't know what the right term is, maybe a level playing field, collaborative professional space, principles of transparency and openness operate very smoothly. But they, I think, were developed without taking into full account the disparities of power that operate where information has been appropriated or created without thinking about the consequences and the impact on the people who are being informationalized. And there's been a lot of work done lately. My colleague Moya Bailey at Northeastern works very much on hashtag activism and does a lot of work thinking about the kinds of visibility of people, right? Not just information, but humans, that results when scholarly attention is paid to people who are, you know, going about their normal lives. And I think if we extend that logic backwards in time and we understand that for many communities that have very, very long histories, there isn't the experience of separateness between people who are somehow historical and don't exist anymore and are fair game, and people who are in the present and can be harmed. In other words, there's a much stronger sense of continuity there. And so it seems to me that, and I think that's attested as well in the materials from Caswell and Poncelan, that the sense of understanding the agency even of people centuries in the past, and the ways in which those people still resonate with their descendants, that's an important move. So I think that, I'm not answering your question, I'm just talking around it, but I'm sort of trying to give some texture to the problem so as not to simply say, oh, drat, we forgot about openness, or oh, drat, we forgot about, it's not a simple balancing act, but it is a balancing act where, at the moment, proponents of open access hold all the cultural power. So that makes me suspicious that there's got to be some kind of better dialogue there. And I think that there may be, and I'm sure smarter, more well-informed people than I are already drawing up protocols that say, control over what information is put into play, control over whose information is put into play belongs with those people. And that once the information is in play, then principles of fair use and so forth operate virtuously to ensure that that information is not controlled by capital, right, but is instead shared as a common good. But the question of, but we can't establish the idea of common good until it's genuinely common. So I think there's an anterior problem of participation and ownership and enfranchisement, perhaps, cultural enfranchisement, that plays into making that kind of decision and establishing a good version of those kinds of standards. I hope that addresses your question or gives us something to think about. I'd be interested to talk more about this. And again, it's not an area of my expertise. So. I'm being blinded by the lights, so I can't see. If you have your hand up and want me to see, you're going to have to wave it in the air. Or I will just take a drink of water.
Yeah, thanks a lot from me as well. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I was wondering, so about the strong models. So on the one hand, I think the consensus in the community has been that strong models enable collaboration, interoperability, common tools, so lots of benefits there. And you showed that there might be, that they also may cause problems for collaboration. So how do we balance that, or maybe even beyond balance, I don't know, how do we deal with this tension in standardization, ultimately?
Another great question. So I should have a good answer for this. You should be able to wake me from a sound sleep, and I should be able to give you an answer to that one. I think what models accomplish in favor of collaboration is mutual intelligibility, right? And efficiency of communication, right? They eliminate the pointless, accidental misunderstandings and disagreements about what to call something that we all agree upon. I think where I see them causing difficulties for collaboration is when there are strata of, I want to say something like granularity, which most typically, in my experience, arise from different levels of resources. In other words, if I'm collaborating with a project next door and we fundamentally agree on, the nature of things, like, metadata for women's writing in early printed books or something like that, the thing after that we're most likely to disagree on is how much we can afford to do. Because, the Women Writers Project is a well-resourced project that has no end in sight, and we're just going to keep whacking away on that thing until we're done, and we can dream big, whatever. But the project that's trying to get off the ground with, one graduate student and needs to show some results because they have a tiny grant and they promised the dean and, whatever. That for them, that level of, that model is a burden and it's an obstacle. And, we can work our way around that through workflow and things like that. But ultimately, I think that's something that we need to think about. And, the TEI, I think, has had in its many years versions of that conversation where it talks about the level of work burden and in a way, there's an epistemological version of the practical burden, which is how much can you afford to know about the things that you're modeling? So that's one thin slice of an answer. I feel as though one could go much further and talk about problems of mapping language onto concepts and the slippages that come when you try to collaborate across epistemological spaces or across cultural spaces. But I'm just going to gesture at that answer for the moment, and we could follow up. Again, I think this is probably an area where this community, or perhaps the European digital humanities community, is in a strong position to think about and is probably already making good strides. So. One last question before dinner. Yeah, in the back. I hope this doesn't mean that everything I said was either deeply obvious or deeply disturbing.
Thank you. Do you think it's an illusion to seek for a general or generic model?
Could you say the question one more time? The microphone didn't kick in right away.
If you think, or do you think it's an illusion to seek for a more general or a generic model?
That's really interesting. So, I think within the scope of our current modeling tools, which are, let's say, operating at this level of abstraction, it is an illusion because by their nature, tools like the Text Encoding Initiative or, friend of a friend or, whatever model you're using, they have established an internally consistent semantics, a closed system, if you like. And what they're modeling has edges. They've decided on the edges of what they're going to model. And universalizing at that level, I think, is madness, but also dramatically unfeasible, right? I mean, the TEI tried to do it by establishing not only these semantically specific things like epigraph and quotation and paragraph, but also generic things like division or segment or anonymous block, which in theory you could use to model, this auditorium or, a hydrogen ion or something like that. But in practice, they still only really make sense for things like documents, let's say, or documents and data. And I think the same, other specific languages and specific models may do a better or worse job of defining and filling a semantic space and perhaps gesturing beyond it with generic things. I think where a generic model, I'm so out of my depth here, wow. I think where a generic model could be imagined is at the level of a meta-modeling language. In other words, I think that, XML does not achieve this because of its, entailments with respect to hierarchy, but something like RDF, it's universal insofar as it says nothing, right? It says only the meta, right? So that's great. It's like a, it's like a big big thing of boxes or cardboard and tape and pens, and you can make all the things you want and you can put all the stuff in them. But it hasn't really gotten you very far. All it gets you is the tool, right? It gets you the thing that the tools can operate on. And I remember being in the room when John Bosak in 1997 announced XML, and how the reason XML was going to be awesome was because there would be tools, because XML is easy to write tools for, and there would be all these tools, and they wouldn't care about the specific model, they would only care about the meta model. And I feel like maybe RDF is going one better than that, because it gets us out of the space where you can model anything as long as it's a tree or something that's like a tree with vines attached to it. This may be me showing my age. I feel like my grandfather told me that he knew he was getting old. He was an electrical engineer. He said he knew he was getting old because the next thing, which at that time was the transistor, made no sense to him. Like, he couldn't kind of get out of his own head. And I feel like maybe RDF for me is the transistor. I was raised on XML and HTML, but I'm hoping that maybe RDF will be that thing. But those younger than me will find out. All right. Yeah, a question in the back.
Thank you. One thing that we also often see in these conferences is the discussion of applications of machine learning to humanities problems. And I wonder if you look at it from this conceptual angle, if especially unsupervised machine learning techniques are not one way to get around this strong modeling action that always superimposes your predefined categories and things like that, but allows us to work more inductively from the data itself. And so how would you relate these two activities with regard to each other?
I'm so glad you asked that, because I had a whole section in here that I was going to, well, I didn't have a whole section. I had a tiny little 2-line thing where I was going to gesture to that question. And then I cut it out because it was not enough. And I said to myself, someone will ask about this, and then we can talk about it more fully. So yes, I think from one perspective, unsupervised modeling produces a model inductively. And that model, in principle, has the characteristics of, I'm not sure if it has all the characteristics of weakness that in Dimmock's terms or Sedgwick's terms are important. But it certainly, you might think that it escapes the kind of a priori theory of the universe that, is the issue with something like the TEI. However, I'm aware of plenty of scholarship recently by people like Safiya Noble and all the others who are looking at the ways in which those models are created, that it suggests that that model is tacitly supervised or invisibly supervised by the data that you're putting into it. Now, this also, this is not news. But I think that what that does is it says we have to pay really close attention to the input data, the training data, and we also have to pay really close attention to the models that training data produces, and not just assume that because they came about inductively that we had nothing to do with them, right? I think they still deserve our critical scrutiny, and in particular, I think we need to look at the effects they have. In other words, we can't just trust them to go out into the world and do their thing because they were unsupervised, and so it's not a problem. We need to think about what it means that we innocently create, we innocently derive, we innocently train a model that turns out to have some very interesting theoretical entailments, and think about the responsibility we might carry for those theoretical entailments. I feel like I'm kind of waving my hands in the air in an ethical way, but I think there's more to it than just saying, hey, the machine did it, and it must be fine. So I hope that's an answer that seems okay. Das stimmt. Okay. I've been told that there's dinner. Far be it from me to stand in the way of dinner. Thank you again so much for these questions and for this opportunity.
Ja, ich möchte Julia Flanders ganz herzlich für diesen inspirierenden Vortrag danken. Ich denke, es wird sehr interessante Gespräche jetzt gleich beim Stehimbiss geben. Ich bin sozusagen die letzte Schranke zwischen Ihnen und dem Buffet, was ich gleich eröffnen werde. Ich wünsche Ihnen in diesem Sinne eine erfolgreiche Konferenz, interessante Gespräche, gute Diskussionen, hoffentlich gleich auch beim Stehempfang. Und für alle, die sich gefragt haben, wie sie nach dem Stehempfang wieder in ihr Hotel kommen, die Information jetzt hier schon mal vorab. Sie haben alle Ihre Busfahrkarte. Alle halbe Stunde zur vollen und zur halben Stunde fährt die Linie 11 in die Stadt. Das heißt, wenn Sie keine Lust mehr haben, müde sind, machen Sie sich auf den Heimweg. Wenn Sie noch einen Spaziergang machen möchten, es ist nicht weit, dann machen Sie einen Spaziergang. Ansonsten wünsche ich Ihnen einen vergnüglichen Abend und das Buffet ist eröffnet.